I always thought if I ever got fired, I'd know why. I'd have seen it coming, some colossal mistake, some blow up, a warning, something. But nothing prepares you for the moment you're called into a conference room on a random Wednesday morning and you're let go with the words, "We've decided to go in a different direction." That's what Bradley said to me. Sat there in his tailored blue suit like he was doing me a favor, sliding a manila folder across the table like we were finalizing a real estate deal, instead of shattering the past 5 years of my life. There was no empathy in his eyes, no regret, just emptiness. Corporate detachment dressed up as professionalism. At first, I thought it was a joke. I blinked, stunned, expecting someone to pop out and say, "Gotcha!" But instead, it was just silence and that weird humming from the fluorescent lights above us. I asked him why, and he said, "Your performance hasn't met expectations." I asked what exactly hadn't met expectations. Because I had never been written up, never missed a deadline, never been anything less than reliable, and he just looked at me like I was a child asking too many questions. "It's a combination of things," he said, like that cleared anything up. He said I didn't speak up enough in meetings, and that I lacked leadership presence, whatever that means. I sat there gripping the edge of the chair, trying to keep my hands from shaking, trying to maintain some illusion of dignity while my entire world tilted sideways. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been slapped in front of a crowd. People turned to look at me, some curious, some smug, a few sympathetic, but no one said a word. I had to pack up my things while a security guard stood by the door. I had 2 little plants, a few framed photos, and a drawer full of highlighters and snacks. 5 years, and it all fit into one sad cardboard box. The worst part wasn't even the humiliation. It was the complete and utter confusion. I replayed every meeting in my head, every interaction with Bradley, every presentation I gave, every late night I spent double-checking policy updates and employee disputes to make sure I hadn't missed something. But I hadn't. That's the thing. I didn't miss anything. I was just quiet. Bradley always liked loud people. He liked people who filled a room. He liked chest puffers and backslappers, people who used corporate buzzwords like currency and laughed too loudly at his mediocre jokes. I wasn't like that. I showed up, I did my job well, and I didn't need to take credit for other people's work to feel important. But in Bradley's world, quiet meant weak. Quiet meant invisible, and that's what I became to him. Invisible, until he decided I wasn't even worth keeping around. I spent the next 3 days curled up in bed, alternating between rage and tears, questioning everything about myself. Maybe I was too quiet. Maybe I didn't belong in a corporate setting. Maybe I was naive to think that being good at your job was enough to keep your job. My parents tried to be supportive, but they didn't really understand. "Well, maybe it's for the best," my mom said. "Now you can find something that makes you happy." She meant well, but it just made me feel worse. My dad offered to send me some money, which I declined, even though my bank account was starting to make me sweat. I felt like a failure, not just professionally, but personally. Like I'd let myself down by trusting the system, by thinking loyalty and hard work would count for something. I didn't have the energy to explain to anyone that it wasn't just about the job. It was about what the job meant. It was about the years I'd spent building something I thought was stable, about the way I'd allowed myself to grow attached to a career that could be ripped away in a 15-minute meeting. By the end of that first week, I had stopped crying, not because I wasn't hurting anymore, but because I'd run out of tears, and something else started to settle in their place. A low, simmering anger, a kind of righteous, bitter awareness that I'd been wronged. Not just fired wronged. I hadn't failed at my job. I'd been pushed out for not playing the game the way Bradley wanted. And the more I thought about that, the more I started to realize just how many little red flags I'd ignored over the years. The offhand comments in meetings, the promotions that went to louder, less competent men, the time I'd confronted him about one of the guys on his team taking credit for my report, and he said, "Don't worry about it, it's a team win." It had never been a team win when he had something to gain. I wasn't ready to bounce back overnight. I wish I could say I had some sudden breakthrough and got back on my feet with a smile. That's not what happened. I applied for jobs I didn't care about. I stared at LinkedIn until the blur of it made my head ache. I felt that shame that creeps in when you realize your identity has been wrapped around your job, and without it, you're not sure who you are anymore. But in the middle of that mess, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I stopped and took inventory. Not just of what had happened, but of what I wanted. For the first time in years, I wasn't beholden to anyone else's schedule. I didn't have to answer emails or attend meetings or play nice in the office politics game. I was free even if I hadn't chosen it. I started freelancing here and there, HR consulting for small businesses. It wasn't glamorous, but it reminded me that I was damn good at what I did. I knew policy, I knew people, and I had instincts that couldn't be taught in a textbook. I joined some networking groups, not the sleazy ones filled with people trying to sell each other things, but real ones, with other women who'd been burned by the system. I heard stories that made mine sound almost tame. It was comforting and horrifying at the same time, like finding out you're not alone in the dark, but realizing just how many people have been left in there too. I didn't tell many people what had happened to me. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But I listened. I watched. And I learned. Then one night, while scrolling half asleep through job postings, I saw something that made me sit up straight. A listing from my old company. Not in HR, but in operations. A lateral position, but one that worked closely with executive leadership. The same leadership that had probably rubber-stamped my termination without a second glance. The position was posted under a new division that had merged in after I'd left. I clicked it out of morbid curiosity, but then I started thinking. I wondered who would be doing the hiring. I wondered if there was a way back in, not as the same person who'd been fired, but as someone new, someone smarter, stronger. And just like that, the seed was planted. Not just a plan, a mission. I didn't want to go back just to get a paycheck. I wanted answers. I wanted to understand why someone like Bradley could play God with people's careers and face no consequences. I wanted to expose the cracks in the system that allowed someone like him to thrive while people like me were tossed aside. But most of all, I wanted him to see me again. I wanted him to look at me and realize that the woman he fired without a second thought was now sitting across from him at the same table. Only this time, she had power. I didn't know how I was going to do it yet. I didn't have a plan, but I had fire. And for the first time in weeks, I felt alive again. The funny thing about being knocked down is that no one really tells you how quiet the comeback can be. There's no spotlight, no music swelling in the background, no one clapping for you while you rebuild your life piece by piece. It's silent, slow, and honestly, kind of lonely. But that's also where the power is. There's something liberating about rising in the shadows, especially after someone like Bradley has written you off. After the job postings and the consulting gigs started to pick up, I forced myself into a new routine. Nothing fancy, just coffee at 8, emails by 9, a few hours of work from my tiny kitchen table, and then a block of time every afternoon I called rebuild mode. That was where the real comeback lived. It was where I learned, applied, connected, studied, and evolved. Quietly. I took online courses in operations management, conflict resolution, and strategic leadership. Not because I needed degrees, but because I wanted to be bulletproof. I'd never again be in a position where someone could tell me I wasn't enough without me having the receipts to prove otherwise. I brushed up on data analysis tools, sharpened my presentation skills, and rebuilt my resume from scratch this time, with confidence, not desperation. Every time I added a new skill, every time I helped a small business solve a big problem, I felt something come back to life inside me. I wasn't just trying to move on. I was getting better, stronger, sharper. And the more I grew, the more I realized just how broken the world I'd left behind had been. Word got around that I'd been let go. Not many people reached out. Corporate folks tend to keep their heads down when someone gets cut. But Nina did. She always had my back. She called me one night, out of the blue, her voice full of concern and fire. "Tessa," she said, "I just found out today. I'm so sorry. That was complete garbage." I didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so I just thanked her. Then she paused and added, "You know he did that to cover his own ass, right?" That stopped me cold. I asked what she meant, and that's when she told me about the mess Bradley had made with the recent vendor contracts. Apparently, he'd pushed through a deal without legal's full review, and it backfired. Someone had to take the heat, and since I handled compliance training for that department well, it was easier to pin it on me. The betrayal burned all over again, but this time, it was mixed with clarity. He hadn't just fired me because I was quiet. He fired me because I was convenient, because I didn't have the power to fight back. And because in his eyes, people like me, steady, quiet, hardworking, are expendable. Nina said she couldn't talk too long because she didn't want it getting back to him, but she promised to keep me updated on what she heard. I knew I couldn't count on anyone on the inside to do anything risky, but just knowing someone there still believed in me gave me fuel. And quietly, without fanfare, I kept moving forward. I started going to a local startup networking meetup every Thursday evening. At first, I hated it. The small talk, the overly enthusiastic, bro energy that came with so many of those circles, it made my skin crawl. But after a few weeks, I started noticing people who weren't there to show off. People like me. People who listened more than they talked. That's where I met Connor. He wasn't flashy, he didn't dominate the conversation. He asked good questions, took mental notes, and had this calm, thoughtful presence that was rare in that scene. We were paired together in a workshop on designing better onboarding processes. And after a few minutes of collaboration, I realized he actually knew his stuff. We talked after the session, nothing too deep. He told me he'd just transferred from the East Coast and was consulting on some systems transitions at a few mid-sized companies. His background was in operations, but he had a soft spot for leadership development. I found myself laughing more than I expected, and when we wrapped up and he handed me his card, I didn't think much of it. But something about the way he said, "It was really refreshing working with someone who actually listens," stuck with me. I walked home that night thinking about how strange it felt to be recognized for something so simple. Listening. The very thing that got me labeled as not vocal enough back in my old job. Over the next few weeks, Connor and I kept running into each other at events. Eventually, we started grabbing coffee before meetups or lingering afterward just to talk. I still hadn't told him what had happened to me, not the whole story anyway. I mentioned that I was in HR and freelancing now, but I didn't say where I'd worked or why I'd left. I wasn't ready to lay it all out, especially not when things were starting to feel easy, safe. It felt good to talk about goals and ideas without the shadow of Bradley hanging over every sentence. And it felt even better to speak with someone who didn't see my quiet nature as a weakness. While that connection grew, I kept building in the background. I created a website for my consulting work. I wrote blog posts about ethical leadership and inclusive hiring practices. Slowly but surely, people started noticing. A mid-sized e-commerce company reached out after reading one of my posts, and I ended up leading a full overhaul of their employee onboarding program. The CEO sent me a thank you note afterward, and I stared at it for 10 minutes, barely able to believe someone actually appreciated my brain without needing me to shout to be heard. It reminded me that I had value, even if one man with a title couldn't see it. Nina and I kept in touch, and she fed me small details here and there. Bradley had been growing more paranoid, micromanaging more than usual. A few people had quietly left the company, citing culture fit issues. One woman in accounting told Nina, off the record, that Bradley had blown up at her in a meeting when she questioned a forecast projection, and he ended up forcing her out within a month. It was a pattern, one I now saw clearly. Bradley didn't just dislike strong women, he actively removed them. I wasn't the first. I definitely wouldn't be the last. And the more I heard, the more determined I became to make sure he couldn't keep doing it forever. Around that time, Connor invited me to a leadership roundtable he was hosting with a few execs and consultants. It was casual, held in the back of a co-working space, but the people there were sharp. These were the kinds of professionals who didn't care how loud you were, they cared how well you thought. That night, I ended up in a breakout group with a woman named Margaret. She was quiet at first, but when she spoke, people listened. Later, I found out she was a regional VP at a major tech firm, and by some twist of fate, She'd recently been brought in as a strategic advisor for a restructured department at my old company. My pulse quickened when I realized that department was the same one now hiring for the position I'd seen online. I didn't make a move right away. I kept showing up, kept building credibility. Margaret and I ended up in another group session a few weeks later, and this time she asked me more about my background. I told her I'd worked in HR for several years, focusing on compliance, employee relations, and internal development. I didn't mention Bradley, not yet. But I saw the spark of interest in her eyes when I described how I helped one team reduce attrition by 30% just by redesigning their feedback structure. She nodded slowly and said, "That's the kind of thinking we need more of." It wasn't a job offer, but it was a door, and I intended to walk through it. The first time I walked back into the building, I felt like I couldn't breathe. The glass doors, the sharp scent of industrial carpet cleaner, the sound of the elevator ding, it all came rushing back. But I wasn't the same woman who had walked out humiliated. I had a different name on my badge now. My role was new. My department was new. Most of the faces I passed in the hallway didn't know me, and the ones who might have recognized me only did a double take before brushing it off. I kept my head down and my voice calm. No flashy entrances, no big announcements, just quiet steps into a battlefield I'd once been pushed off of. Landing the job had taken finesse. After the round table, I stayed in touch with Margaret. I didn't push, I didn't beg, I just stayed present, offered insight, shared ideas, and when she mentioned her new initiative, an internal project to modernize learning and development, I offered to consult. She gave me a trial run, then 2 weeks later, she said they needed someone to lead the rebuild from inside. That's when I told her I was open to a contract-to-hire deal, under a different name. I didn't lie. I didn't fabricate a backstory. I just shortened my full name to T.R. Hayes and used my middle name professionally. No one questioned it. And so, just like that, I was back. I was assigned to the new learning systems team, on the other side of the company from where I'd worked before. The department was part of a restructure meant to modernize HR and operations, a different floor, a different team, and a completely different reporting line. Bradley had no clue I was even in the building. His office was still upstairs, and from what I'd heard, he rarely interacted with this part of the org unless something blew up. I kept my head low, spoke only when needed, and made myself useful without drawing too much attention. It was hard, biting my tongue in meetings when I knew I had the perfect answer. But I reminded myself this wasn't about glory, it was about groundwork. Every morning I came in early, I studied the org chart, paid attention to workflows, listened more than I talked. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. There were cracks forming in Bradley's kingdom. People were jumping ship. A few mid-level managers had been quietly replaced. Budgets were getting reviewed by external consultants. There was talk of accountability coming down from the top, and Bradley's name kept popping up in hushed conversations as someone whose numbers weren't adding up. I didn't celebrate, not yet. I just kept gathering information. I had a front row seat now, and I intended to use it. The new department was filled with fresh hires, and most of them didn't know the company's history. They had no idea who Bradley was. To them, I was just Tessa Hayes, the calm, capable contractor who could fix messy systems and smooth out onboarding chaos. I became someone they relied on. The director of our team, a no-nonsense woman named Helen, started giving me more responsibility. I led a few meetings, designed a new feedback framework, put together a presentation for leadership that got passed all the way to the C-suite, and still, I stayed quiet. Because the more valuable I became, the less they questioned where I came from. Eventually, I got access to the shared HR archives. Nothing confidential, just general records for planning purposes. But tucked away in that system was a folder labeled Legacy Documents. And in it, I found pieces of the project I'd been fired over. My name had been scrubbed from the timeline, but I knew the formatting, I knew the language, I knew which parts were mine. And there, buried in the notes, was the original legal review Bradley had ignored, the one that flagged the vendor risk I'd warned him about. It was all still there, and even better, someone had added a follow-up note 6 months later, showing how the issue had cost the company nearly $200,000. My hands shook when I saw it. Not out of anger, out of possibility. I started documenting, quietly, carefully. I compiled a timeline, printed reports, saved files. Not to leak or blackmail anyone, I wasn't reckless, but because I knew that eventually I'd need to lay the truth out in front of someone who mattered. I didn't need revenge through rumors. I needed accountability backed by facts. Bradley had gotten away with too much for too long, and it was finally catching up to him. But the part that made me feel the most powerful was that he still didn't even know I was there. I'd sat in on 2 all-hands meetings he attended virtually. He never noticed me, never glanced twice at the list of attendees. I was invisible again, but this time by choice. Outside of work, things with Connor were growing steadily. He still didn't know the full story. I told him bits and pieces, that I'd left a toxic job, that I was rebuilding, that I'd been hurt by a manager who saw me as disposable. But I didn't tell him that I'd returned to the same company, or that the man I was gathering evidence against still had no idea I was back. It wasn't because I didn't trust him. It was because I didn't want anyone talking me out of it. What I was doing wasn't illegal, it wasn't dramatic, it was strategic. And sometimes, you have to do the work in silence before anyone gets to see the results. Over the weeks, I began forming alliances inside. People who didn't know the full extent of what had happened to me, but respected what I brought to the table. One of the younger analysts, Rachel, often stayed late. She told me one night that she used to be on Bradley's team, briefly, but transferred after too many weird vibes. She didn't elaborate, but the way she said it told me enough. I asked her what kind of weird vibes. She shrugged and said, "He yells when he's nervous, and he always needs someone to blame." I figured it was safer to move. I stored that away. It matched everything I'd come to learn. Then came the opportunity I'd been waiting for. Margaret invited me to present my onboarding redesign to a cross-functional leadership group. Bradley would be in the room, not alone, not in a one-on-one where he could cut me off, but in a room where he'd be expected to listen. I worked late the night before, fine-tuning the deck. I practiced my timing, made sure my tone was calm, confident, professional. I wasn't going to make it personal. I wasn't going to mention the past. I was going to show up, do the job, and let my work speak louder than any accusation ever could. When the meeting started, I saw his name pop up on the screen. Bradley Voss. Still using the same headshot from 5 years ago. Still holding on to that title like it made him untouchable. I kept my voice steady as I presented. I saw his eyes flicker when I spoke. Recognition hovered for a moment like a cloud he couldn't quite identify, but then it passed. He didn't say a word. He just scribbled something in his notebook and leaned back. The rest of the room responded well. Questions, praise, even a few requests to adapt the model to other departments. When it was over, Margaret gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "You did it." After the meeting, I stepped out onto the terrace behind the building. It was late afternoon, the sky tinted gold, the city buzzing beneath me. I leaned on the railing and let the wind hit my face. I had been back for 6 weeks, rebuilding my reputation under a new name, rewriting the story they tried to bury. And Bradley? He was still upstairs, clinging to a power he didn't know was slipping through his fingers. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need revenge that looked like a movie. I just needed to keep going, one small, deliberate move at a time. It started with a single file. One document that had been sitting quietly in the HR archive system for over a year, untouched, forgotten. But when I printed it out and placed it next to the internal memo from the legal team, the one that warned against signing the vendor contract, I saw the full picture. It was the kind of proof people talk about in whispers but never actually find. The kind that doesn't just make someone look bad, it buries them. I didn't rush. I didn't storm into any offices or demand justice. I did what I'd learned to do best. I waited, I planned, and I let the pieces fall into place. Nina was the first to officially come on board. I told her everything, every step I'd taken, every file I'd saved, every interaction I'd tracked since coming back. She was stunned at first, then furious, not just at what Bradley had done to me, but at how easily he'd gotten away with it. She'd always known he was manipulative, but she hadn't realized how deep it went. Together, we mapped out the timeline. The emails I sent warning about the vendor risk, the contract that was pushed through anyway, the consequences, and then the final insult. My termination under the vague excuse of performance issues. Nina still worked in compliance, and she knew how to read the signs. She said, "Tessa, this isn't just unethical. This could be a full-on liability issue if it's brought to light." Next came Connor. I didn't mean to involve him. I kept trying to keep him outside of it, keep things simple. But when he noticed how distracted I was, how much time I spent combing through files and scribbling notes, he finally asked, "What's really going on, Tess?" And I told him. Everything. His reaction wasn't dramatic. He didn't gasp or rage, he just sat quietly and listened, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he said, "Okay, let's figure out how to handle this the smart way." That's when I realized I hadn't just rebuilt a career. I'd built a team, a circle of people who believed me, who stood by me, who were willing to help me set things right. Margaret was the last to be brought in. I didn't approach her directly. Instead, I shared my final onboarding redesign presentation with her and included a footnote referencing the vendor issue, with links to the original legal review. Nothing accusatory, just a line of text that said, "Reference, original vendor review, dated April 11th, escalation chain, incomplete." I knew she'd recognize the wording. She was sharp, and she did. 2 days later, she called me into her office and closed the door. Her voice was quiet but steady as she said, "Tell me what you found." I laid it out, carefully and respectfully. I didn't ask her to take sides. I just showed her the evidence. Her expression didn't change as she flipped through the printouts, but I saw the shift in her eyes. When she finished, she said, "We'll need to..." It moved quickly after that. Margaret escalated the findings to the Internal Ethics Committee, bypassing Bradley entirely. She had enough seniority and credibility that no one questioned her decision. HR scheduled a quiet inquiry under the pretense of a regular departmental review. Nina provided corroboration from her compliance files. And Connor? He offered to consult on the investigation logistics without ever once revealing our relationship. The man was a fortress, professional, discreet, and fiercely protective. He understood what was at stake, not just for me, but for everyone Bradley had hurt. Then came the real explosion. The ethics team uncovered more than we expected. It turned out that Bradley had a long pattern of manipulating performance reviews, pushing out employees who challenged him and rerouting accountability whenever mistakes surfaced. There were emails redacted but traceable where he coerced a junior manager into taking blame for a budget overage that wasn't hers. Another showed him overriding a leave request for someone on medical recovery, then citing lack of commitment as cause for termination. And worst of all, there were notes from 2 HR reps who'd tried to raise concerns to the previous CHRO. But they'd been shut down. The cover-up ran deep. When it all came to light, everything changed. Leadership launched a formal investigation. Bradley was put on leave, pending review, which was corporate speak for, "We're collecting enough rope to hang you." The day his name disappeared from the internal directory, I got a Slack message from Rachel, the young analyst who once called him a walking red flag. It said, "Did you see the news? Feels like justice." I didn't reply right away. I just sat at my desk, staring at my screen, letting the weight of it settle. It had taken months. Quiet moves, careful planning. But the fall had come, and it had come hard. I didn't expect the aftermath to feel so strange. Part of me thought I'd feel victorious, powerful, maybe even a little smug. But mostly I felt tired, relieved, and a little heartbroken. Not for Bradley, of course, but for the version of myself that had once believed silence made you safe. For every woman who sat through a meeting swallowing her voice. For every person who was told they weren't enough when they were simply not loud enough to be threatening. Bradley wasn't just a bad manager. He was a symptom of a culture that rewarded power over ethics, volume over value, bravado over character. But his fall proved something else too, that even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones, can bring down giants. The official report was released to senior staff only, but word traveled fast. The executive team issued a statement about leadership realignment and reinforcing ethical standards. Margaret was promoted to a new role overseeing leadership development across the company. Nina was asked to co-lead a task force on compliance culture. And me? I was offered a permanent position, full-time, senior level, with a team of my own. I didn't say yes right away. I needed to sit with it, to make sure I wasn't just reacting to the high of victory. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just revenge. This was redemption. This was a chance to build something better from the inside. I accepted the offer. On my terms, with one condition. I asked that we create an internal audit pathway for employees who felt they were being unfairly targeted or silenced, anonymous reporting, escalation protections, a real system, not just a checkbox. Margaret agreed without hesitation. She said, "We should have had this years ago." And I smiled because for the first time, I wasn't just being heard. I was helping others be heard too. Bradley never contacted me. I doubt he ever will. Last I heard, he'd hired a PR consultant and was shopping his resume around to smaller firms out of state. He'll probably land somewhere. Guys like him usually do. But now there's a record. A paper trail. A list of decisions tied to his name that don't just disappear. And maybe, just maybe, the next time he tries to bulldoze someone quieter than him, they'll have the tools to push back. Or better yet, they won't have to, because someone like me already made sure the road was safer. One night, not long after the dust had settled, I sat with Connor on the rooftop of his building, the city lights stretching out beneath us. I told him I still had days where I replayed it all. The firing, the isolation, the doubt. And he said, "That's the part people never talk about. The scars you carry even after you win." He wasn't wrong. But he also reminded me of something else. That healing isn't about erasing the pain. It's about choosing what you build from it. And I'd built something I never thought I'd have again. Respect, stability, purpose, and maybe most importantly, a voice. The quiet ones aren't weak. We aren't forgettable. We aren't failures. We're watchers, learners, builders. We see what others miss. We listen when others talk, and when we rise, we don't need to shout. We just need to show up, do the work, and let the truth speak for itself. Bradley Cole learned that the hard way, and I learned that silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes, it's the source of it. The day I walked into his old office didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like stepping into a ghost's house. Bradley's name was gone from the plaque. The desk had been cleared, except for a small scratch near the edge where he used to slam his laptop closed. The chair still creaked in the same spot when I leaned back. But everything else? It was mine now. The view of the skyline, the files, the calendar invites, every inch of it belonged to me, and yet I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something else entirely. Something steadier. Like resolution. Like finally exhaling after holding my breath for too long. I didn't get the job overnight. It was a process. Leadership opened the position quietly after Bradley's departure and asked internal candidates to apply. My name was the first one floated. I was hesitant, not because I didn't think I could do it, but because I knew exactly what came with it. The pressure, the scrutiny, the expectation to fix everything Bradley had broken. But Margaret looked me straight in the eye during our meeting and said, "We need someone who understands the damage and how not to repeat it." That hit me hard, because I didn't just survive it, I understood it. Every crack in the system, every missed red flag, I had lived it, and I wasn't about to waste that experience. The interview panel included 3 senior VPs, 1 board member, and Nina, who represented the compliance arm. I didn't go in trying to prove anything. I didn't list out every reason why I deserved the role. I just spoke plainly. I told them what I'd seen, what I'd learned, and what I would do differently. I didn't pretend to have all the answers, but I made it clear I had the right questions. At the end of the interview, one of the VPs asked me, "What's the first thing you'd change?" And I said, "The culture of fear. People need to know they can speak up without losing everything." There was a long silence in the room, the kind that usually means someone just said something true. And a week later, I got the call. The job was mine. When the announcement went out, I was in a meeting with my new team. I hadn't told them yet. The moment the notification popped up on the company-wide channel, there was a beat of stunned silence. Then Rachel, the same young analyst who once rolled her eyes at Bradley behind his back, whispered, "No freaking way," and started clapping. The others joined in slowly, unsure if it was okay to celebrate. I just laughed and said, "Looks like we've got work to do." And from that moment on, it was real. I wasn't just a comeback story. I was the new standard. The first few weeks were chaos in the most beautiful way. I didn't just inherit Bradley's title, I inherited his mess. Overdue reports, neglected teams, burned out managers, and a paper trail of broken trust. But I didn't run from it. I met with every department head personally. I listened. I asked the questions Bradley never bothered to ask. What do you need? What's not working? What's getting in your way? And people answered me. Carefully at first, then honestly, because I wasn't just their new boss. I was proof that things could actually change. Connor and I had talked about what this would mean for us. My promotion, the added pressure, the attention. He didn't flinch. Not once. He just said, "You were always meant to lead. I saw it before anyone else did." He was right, but the difference now was, I saw it too. I'd stopped shrinking myself, stopped second-guessing. I no longer worried about being too quiet or too careful or too soft. I was done twisting myself into something smaller to make others more comfortable. I led with empathy, clarity, and a zero-tolerance policy for games. And slowly, the energy started to shift. People came to me with real concerns, not whispers in the hallway or anonymous tips, but face-to-face, real conversations. I wasn't just managing, I was rebuilding. I overhauled our performance review system. I brought Nina in to create an anonymous escalation tool. I asked Rachel to co-lead a mentorship initiative for junior analysts. I pulled together task forces that actually had teeth, the kinds of changes Bradley would have mocked or ignored. But they worked, and people noticed. One afternoon, Margaret dropped by my office. She leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, and smiled in that rare way she reserved for moments that actually impressed her. She said, "You've done more in 2 months than some VPs do in a year." I shrugged and told her I was just trying not to screw it up. She laughed and said, "Tessa, you're not surviving anymore, you're leading." And that stuck with me, because she was right. I wasn't clinging to this role out of fear or desperation. I was standing in it fully, owning it, living it. There was one moment that hit me harder than all the others. I was walking past the old conference room where I'd once sat quietly while Bradley dismantled my career with a smug smile and an empty accusation, and I saw a new team in there, a group of interns presenting ideas to 2 department heads. They were laughing, relaxed, engaged. No fear, no tension, just possibility. And I realized this was the real victory. Not the title, not the office, but the ripple effect. I had taken something toxic and turned it into something human again. Eventually, people stopped mentioning Bradley. His name faded. New hires didn't even know who he was, and that, honestly, felt like the best justice. He didn't deserve a legacy, but I was building one every single day. Not by being the loudest, not by playing politics, but by showing up, telling the truth, and doing the work. I didn't need to crush anyone to rise. I just needed to refuse to stay down. A few months later, I was asked to speak at a leadership retreat. The theme was resilience. They wanted a story. I almost said no. But then I thought about who might be in the audience, some quiet, capable woman wondering if she was the problem. And I agreed. I stood in front of that room, took a breath, and told them what happened. The firing, the comeback, the fall of a toxic leader, the rise of something better. And when I finished, there was a silence. Not the awkward kind, the powerful kind. Then, applause. Real, sustained, almost grateful. And I knew. I wasn't just leading a department. I was reminding people what leadership could look like. I never imagined I'd end up here. I didn't plan for revenge or redemption or rising this far this fast. I just wanted to survive. But the thing is, when you survive with your values intact, you don't just recover. You transform. You grow. You become the kind of leader people remember. Not because you demanded respect, but because you earned it. So yes, I took his job, but I didn't become him. I became myself, louder, wiser, braver. And I never once forgot how it felt to be on the other side of that desk. That's what keeps me grounded. That's what keeps me real. That's why, every single day, I walk into this office with my head high and my heart steady. Because now I'm the boss.